The bar was not somewhere I belonged. At least, that's what I told myself as I sat there, nursing a martini I wasn't even sure I liked. It was my first time ordering one. It had seemed sophisticated in the moment, but the sharp, herbal taste wasn't what I expected. I swirled the glass idly, staring at the olives, trying to look occupied while my stomach churned with unease. I was in the city for a work conference, a rare chance for someone like me to step out of my usual routine. In my 30s and unmarried, I was often pegged as the career woman in my office. Polite, competent, dependable Linda. A woman who stayed late to help others meet deadlines, but never stayed late at parties. I wasn't unhappy with my life, but there were times I wondered if I was truly living it or just passing through. That night, the hotel room had felt unbearably quiet. The television buzzed in the corner, but it wasn't enough to drown out my restlessness. I didn't know what I was looking for when I stepped into the elevator, but the idea of being in the bar, surrounded by life, seemed better than staring at the bland beige walls of my room. My nerves had other ideas once I got there, though. It was a busy Friday night, and the room pulsed with energy, laughter, music, glasses clinking. I felt out of place, a dull gray moth in a room full of shimmering butterflies. I kept my head down, focusing on my drink, when I heard a voice beside me. "You don't strike me as a martini type." I looked up, startled. The man sitting next to me had a presence that seemed to occupy the entire space. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. His tie was slightly loosened, as if he'd just finished an important meeting but hadn't yet decided to call it a night. His hair was thick and dark, streaked with the faintest hints of silver at the temples, and his eyes, oh, his eyes, were warm and amused, as though he'd caught me in the middle of a private joke. "I don't?" I managed, my voice quieter than I intended. I cleared my throat, trying to summon some confidence. "What do I strike you as?" He tilted his head, studying me for a moment. "A wine drinker, maybe." "Red." "Something soft, but with a little kick." "Pinot Noir, perhaps?" I couldn't help but smile, a nervous little thing that felt foreign on my face. "Well, I suppose I'm branching out," I said, glancing at the glass in front of me. "Trying new things." "Adventurous," he said, his tone teasing but not unkind. "I like that." I wasn't sure what to say. My instinct was to excuse myself, but something about him held me in place. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, not in a predatory way but with genuine interest, as if he had all the time in the world to hear what I had to say. It had been a long time since someone looked at me like that, and longer still since I'd allowed myself to enjoy it. "I'm William," he said, offering his hand. "Linda," I replied, shaking it. His grip was firm but not overbearing, his palm warm against mine. "So, Linda," he said, leaning slightly closer, "what brings you to this corner of the world? Business, pleasure, or something in between?" "Business," I said quickly. "I'm here for a conference." "And yet here you are, sipping a martini alone on a Friday night," he said, his tone light but laced with curiosity. "What's the story there?" "I needed a change of scenery," I admitted. The hotel room was quiet. "Ah, I know the feeling." He smiled, and for the first time, I noticed the faint lines around his eyes. They weren't the marks of stress, but of a man who had spent a good deal of his life smiling. Silence can be a blessing or a curse, depending on the company. I blushed, caught off guard by his casual honesty. "I guess I'm still deciding which it is for me." He chuckled, and the sound was warm, like a fire crackling on a cold night. "Well, if you're willing, I'd be happy to help you tip the scales tonight. Join me for a drink? Something you might actually enjoy this time." I hesitated. It was a harmless invitation, friendly, even, but something about it felt like a step into unknown territory. I could feel the wall I'd built around myself over the years, the invisible boundary that kept me safe but also separate, begin to waver. Finally, I nodded. "All right. But I get to pick." His grin widened, and he signaled the bartender. "A glass of Pinot Noir for the lady," he said without missing a beat, then turned back to me. Soft, but with a kick. Am I right? I laughed, surprising myself with how easy it felt. Lucky guess. Not luck, he said. Just a talent for reading people. The wine arrived, and we clinked glasses. As the first sip warmed me, I found myself leaning into the conversation. William was unlike anyone I had ever met, charming but not overbearing, curious without being intrusive. He had a way of making me feel like the most important person in the room, and for once, I didn't question why. Hours passed in a blur of laughter and stories. I told him about my job, my dreams, my fears, the kind of things I never shared with anyone. And he listened, really listened, as if each word mattered. He told me about his travels, his love for jazz, and the pressures of a life filled with wealth and expectations. For a man who seemed to have everything, he carried a quiet sadness, an ache I couldn't quite place. By the time the bartender announced last call, I realized I didn't want the night to end. The bar was beginning to thin out, the boisterous hum of earlier hours giving way to the quieter sounds of clinking glasses and muted conversation. Last call had been announced, but neither William nor I seemed ready to leave. It wasn't just the wine, or his charm, though both had loosened the usual tight grip I kept on myself. It was the way he made the world feel smaller and more intimate, like a bubble we were suspended in, safe and detached from the rest of reality. As the bartender began wiping down the counter, William leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on mine. They held a quiet intensity, the kind that could make you forget how to breathe for a moment. "Dance with me," he said, his voice low but confident. I blinked, caught off guard. Dance? Here? Why not? He gestured to the small corner of the bar where the jazz band had played earlier. Though they had long since packed up, the low hum of a recording, Miles Davis, I thought, still played softly through the speakers. I promise, I'm not a terrible dancer. I hesitated, glancing around the room. A few patrons lingered, some casting fleeting glances our way, but most were absorbed in their own conversations. I don't know, I started, my voice trailing off. He stood, offering his hand. Come on, Linda. You said you were trying new things tonight. His smile was teasing, but his outstretched hand was steady and sure, a lifeline into uncharted waters. My heart fluttered with a mixture of nerves and something else, something warm and thrilling, like stepping into sunlight after a cold day. Against my better judgment, or perhaps because of it, I placed my hand in his. William led me to the open space, near the bar. It wasn't a dance floor, not officially, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The faint strains of the music were enough. He rested one hand gently on my waist, his other still holding mine, and began to move. At first, I was stiff, self-conscious of my awkwardness, but his confidence had a way of bleeding into me. Slowly, I let myself relax, matching his steps, letting him guide me. You're doing better than you think, he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. I laughed softly, my cheeks flushing. You're just being polite. Not at all, he said, his voice carrying that effortless charm I was beginning to find dangerously addictive. You're a natural. I wasn't, of course. I had never been the type of woman to command a room or glide gracefully through life. But with William, I felt different. I felt seen, as though he had found something in me even I hadn't known was there. And for once, I let myself believe it. We moved together in an easy rhythm, swaying to the smooth, sultry notes of the music. His touch was firm yet gentle, his hand steady against the small of my back. It wasn't just a dance, it was a conversation, one spoken without words, but no less profound. I felt the tension I had carried for years, the constant striving, the fear of never being enough, begin to melt away, replaced by a sense of lightness I hadn't known I was capable of. Tell me something, he said after a while, his tone casual, but curious. What's a woman like you doing alone in a city like this? I tilted my head, meeting his gaze. A woman like me? I repeated, raising an eyebrow. You know what I mean, he said with a small grin. Smart, lovely, with a mind that seems to run deeper than most. Surely someone's noticed that by now. I looked away, focusing on the faint pattern of his tie. It was easier than meeting his eyes, which seemed to see far too much. "I've been busy," I said after a moment. "Work, mostly. It doesn't leave a lot of room for other things." "Other things," he echoed, his voice thoughtful. "Like dancing in hotel bars with strangers?" I laughed, the sound light and unguarded. "Exactly. Though I suppose I've made an exception tonight." "I'm honored," he said, his tone softening. There was a sincerity in his voice that caught me off guard, as if he genuinely meant it. And a little curious. "Why now?" It was a good question, one I wasn't entirely sure how to answer. Why had I come to the bar that night? Why had I let him pull me into this unexpected, enchanting moment? Maybe it was the weight of my own loneliness, the quiet ache of moving through life without ever truly connecting. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe I just wanted to feel something real, something alive. I don't know, I admitted, my voice quieter now. I think I needed a reminder." "A reminder of what?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "That life doesn't have to be so predictable," I said, struggling to find the right words. "That there's more to it than schedules and deadlines, and doing what's expected of you." William's gaze softened, his expression shifting to something more serious. "I think you're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes we forget. Sometimes we need someone else to remind us." The song ended, but neither of us moved. We stood there for a moment, suspended in the quiet between one note and the next. The bar had emptied further, the hum of voices reduced to a faint murmur in the background. I was aware of the closeness between us, the warmth of his hand still on my waist, the faint scent of his cologne, a mix of cedar and something faintly sweet. It was the kind of moment I might have once dismissed as fleeting, inconsequential. But standing there with William, I felt its weight, its significance. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to let it go. The silence between us was neither awkward nor uncomfortable, it was charged, like the stillness before a storm. William's hand lingered gently at my waist, and though the music had stopped, I still felt its rhythm, the way it seemed to sync with my heartbeat. For a moment, the world outside the bar didn't exist. There were no meetings, no deadlines, no carefully structured plans. Just him and me, and the unspoken weight of a question hanging in the air. "I don't want this night to end yet," he said finally, his voice soft but deliberate. His words weren't rushed, nor were they demanding. He said them as though he was offering a gift, one that I could take or leave without judgment. I swallowed, suddenly very aware of how close we were. The warmth of his hand against my back, the way his breath brushed against my cheek. My first instinct was to step away, to retreat back to the safety of the familiar. But something deep inside me, a small, rebellious part of myself that had been quiet for too long, whispered to stay. "Neither do I heard myself say, my voice barely audible. It startled me, the truth of it, and yet it felt undeniably right. William studied me for a moment, as if searching for any hesitation in my expression. "Come with me," he said, his words simple, but filled with meaning. He stepped back slightly, giving me space to decide, his hand falling away from my waist. "No expectations. Just, more of this. Whatever this is." I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because the enormity of what he was offering frightened me. I wasn't the kind of woman who did things like this. I had spent my entire life making careful, calculated decisions, always staying within the lines. The idea of stepping outside of them, even for a moment, felt both thrilling and terrifying. And yet, as I looked into his eyes, I saw nothing but sincerity. He wasn't pressuring me. He wasn't trying to convince me. He was simply asking, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone truly wanted me, not for what I could do, or how I could help them, but simply for who I was. "Okay," I said softly, almost before I realized I had made the decision. A smile flickered across his lips, but it wasn't triumphant. It was gentle, almost relieved, as if he had been waiting for me to trust myself as much as he already seemed to trust me. The elevator ride to his suite was quiet, but not awkwardly so. William stood beside me, his hands resting loosely at his sides, respecting the space between us. I appreciated that. He wasn't assuming anything, wasn't rushing. He was letting me set the pace, letting me hold on to the control I so often felt slipping from my grasp in the chaos of daily life. The suite, when we arrived, was stunning. It was far more luxurious than my modest room on a lower floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, lights twinkling like stars against the dark canvas of the night. A plush sofa sat in the center of the room, facing a low coffee table with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses already waiting. "I wasn't sure if you liked red or white," William said, his voice breaking the silence as he walked toward the table. "But I figured I couldn't go wrong with this." He held up the bottle, its label expensive and elegant. "Red is perfect," I said, managing a small smile. He poured 2 glasses, then handed one to me before taking a seat on the sofa. He didn't motion for me to join him right away, giving me the space to take it all in. I wandered to the window instead, staring out at the city below. It felt so alive, so full of possibility, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. I felt like I was part of it, if only for a night. "You look like you're somewhere else," William said, his tone warm and curious. "Not somewhere," I replied, turning to face him. "Someone. I don't think I've felt this present in a long time." He tilted his head, studying me as though I'd just revealed something important. "That's rare," he said softly. "Most of us spend so much time caught up in the past or the future that we forget about now." I nodded, moving to sit beside him. I think I'd been guilty of that. Always thinking about the next step, the next goal. I guess I thought if I kept moving forward, I wouldn't have to face what I might be missing. "And what do you think you're missing?" he asked, his voice quiet but probing. I hesitated, staring down at my glass. The question felt too big, too heavy, and yet I knew the answer. I had known it for years, even if I hadn't been brave enough to admit it. "Connection," I said finally. "Real connection. Something that doesn't feel like a transaction." William didn't say anything at first. He simply reached over and placed his hand over mine, his touch grounding me. "You deserve that, Linda," he said, his voice steady and sure. "You deserve to be seen. To be heard." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. I wasn't used to hearing things like that, let alone believing them. But with William, it didn't feel like flattery or manipulation. It felt like truth. The hours that followed were a blur of conversation and laughter, of small touches and lingering gazes. It wasn't rushed or frantic, it was slow, deliberate, and deeply intimate in ways that went beyond the physical. For the first time in years, I felt like I could let my guard down, like I could be myself without fear of judgment. And when the moment came, when our connection deepened in ways I hadn't dared to imagine, it wasn't something I regretted. It was something I embraced, wholeheartedly and without reservation. For that one night, I allowed myself to simply be, to feel, to live. As I drifted to sleep in his arms, the city lights casting faint patterns across the walls, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I didn't know what the morning would bring, and for once, I didn't care. The first thing I noticed was the light. It streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the suite in a soft golden glow. It was different from the muted light of my small hotel room, a reminder of the space I was in, a space that wasn't mine. For a moment, I lay there in the quiet, the sheets tangled around me, and let the memories of the night before come flooding back. William's arm was draped loosely over my waist, his breathing slow and steady against the back of my neck. I could feel the warmth of him, hear the faint rise and fall of his breath. It was grounding, and yet it felt so surreal. I hadn't let myself imagine this, the closeness, the vulnerability, the sheer possibility of it all. I turned my head slightly, catching a glimpse of him. He looked peaceful, his features softened in sleep. The faint lines around his eyes seemed less pronounced, and I wondered what dreams he was lost in. Seeing him like this, so unguarded, stirred something in me, a tenderness I wasn't sure I had the right to feel after just one night. But it wasn't just one night, was it? That thought lingered, heavy and insistent. It wasn't just the hours we spent together. It was everything that led up to it, the way he had seen me, truly seen me, in a way no one else had for so long. And the way I had let him in, despite every instinct to keep my walls firmly intact. The warmth of the moment began to fade as reality crept in. The conference. My flight home. The version of Linda who would leave this room wasn't the same one who had entered it, but she still had obligations waiting for her. A life that didn't include William. I shifted slightly, careful not to wake him, and slipped out of bed. The cool air of the suite made me shiver as I crossed to the window, wrapping the sheet around me. The city stretched out below, alive and humming, indifferent to the quiet transformation I was feeling inside. I stood there for a while, letting the weight of it all sink in, before I felt his presence behind me. Couldn't sleep? His voice was low, slightly rough with sleep, but there was a gentleness in it that made me turn. I woke up and couldn't stop thinking, I said, offering a faint smile. I didn't want to wake you. William walked closer, his steps unhurried. He was barefoot, his shirt still unbuttoned from the night before, and he carried himself with the kind of ease I had come to recognize as uniquely his. Thinking about what? He asked, stopping just a few feet away. I hesitated, glancing back at the skyline. About what happens next. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then he reached out, his hand brushing mine, grounding me in the present. What if there doesn't have to be a next, he said softly. What if we just let this be what it is? His words were both a comfort and a challenge. Could I do that? Could I hold on to this moment without demanding more of it? Without trying to fit it into the neat little boxes I'd built for my life? I wanted to say yes, but a part of me, the part that had spent years chasing certainty and control, struggled with the idea. I don't regret anything, I said finally, turning to face him. Not a single moment. But I'm not sure I know how to let go without trying to define it. William smiled, a soft, understanding expression that only deepened the ache in my chest. You don't have to define it, Linda. You just have to feel it. I let his words settle over me, let them sink into the cracks of my overthinking. Maybe he was right. Maybe this didn't need to be anything more than what it already was, a moment of connection, fleeting but deeply real. I nodded, more to myself than to him. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face, his touch light and reverent. Stay for breakfast, he said, his voice tinged with hope. Or at least coffee. I laughed softly, a sound that felt foreign but welcome. Coffee sounds nice. We sat at the small dining table near the window, the city sprawling below us as we sipped from steaming mugs. The conversation was easy, lighter than the night before, but no less meaningful. He asked me about the places I wanted to visit, the dreams I had put off for someday. I asked him about his favorite cities, the books that had changed him, the lessons he'd learned in a life so different from mine. It was strange, this intimacy we shared after only hours of knowing each other. But it felt natural, as if we had skipped past the formalities and found a way to speak directly to the essence of who we were. When the coffee was gone, the quiet returned. I felt the weight of the day pressing in, the conference, my obligations, the life waiting for me outside this bubble we had created. William seemed to sense it, his gaze searching mine. You don't have to explain, he said gently, as though reading my thoughts. I get it. I wish I could stay, I said honestly. But I can't. He nodded, his expression tinged with something I couldn't quite place, acceptance, perhaps, or maybe regret. Then let me say this before you go, he said, leaning forward slightly. Last night, it meant something to me. You mean something to me, Linda. And if I had all the time in the world, I'd spend it trying to know you. The words hit me like a wave, both beautiful and overwhelming. I wanted to respond, but no words felt adequate. Instead, I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine. He smiled, and that was enough. As I left the suite, the bracelet I had worn the night before rested on the nightstand, a small token, a quiet goodbye. I stepped into the elevator, the weight of what I was leaving behind pressing against my chest. When the doors closed, I allowed myself one deep breath, letting it carry the memory of William, of the night, of the woman I had been with him. I didn't look back. But I carried him with me, in ways I wouldn't fully understand until years later. The elevator ride back to my floor felt impossibly long. Each ding of the descending floors pulled me further from William, from the version of myself I had allowed to exist for one extraordinary night. By the time I reached my room, the magic of it all seemed like a dream, fleeting and fragile, slipping through my fingers as the responsibilities of the day closed in around me. I showered, letting the hot water wash away the remnants of the night, his cologne on my skin, the faint trace of his touch, the warmth that had lingered in my chest. I dressed in the same gray suit I had worn 2 days earlier, the one that felt more like armor than clothing, and tied my hair back in a tight, sensible bun. By the time I looked in the mirror, I had reconstructed myself, practical, composed, professional Linda. But no matter how polished I appeared on the outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had shifted. The reflection staring back at me wasn't quite the same. Her eyes carried a new kind of weight, not heavy with regret but brimming with the knowledge of something she hadn't dared to feel in years. It was as though a light had been turned on in a room I'd forgotten existed. I gathered my belongings and headed down to the conference. The day was a blur of presentations, handshakes, and polite conversations. I tried to focus, but my mind kept wandering back to William. His words echoed in my head, soft but insistent, "You mean something to me, Linda." What had I meant to him, really? Was I just a fleeting moment of escape, a passing connection in the midst of his well-curated life? Or had it been something more? I didn't know, and the not knowing gnawed at me. But I reminded myself that I had made my choice, and there was no room in my life for what-ifs. When I returned home, the familiar rhythm of my routine quickly asserted itself. My desk at work was piled with paperwork that required my immediate attention, and my calendar was filled with meetings and deadlines. I threw myself into it all, determined to drown out the echoes of that night with the hum of productivity. But no matter how busy I stayed, William lingered in the quiet moments. I'd think of him when I walked past a wine shop and spotted a bottle of Pinot Noir in the window. I'd hear his voice when a jazz song played on the radio, the notes carrying me back to that small bar and the way he'd held me as we danced. It wasn't sadness or regret that accompanied these memories, it was something softer, a bittersweet ache that felt like both a comfort and a burden. At night, lying alone in bed, I'd catch myself reaching for the bracelet I had left behind, only to remember it wasn't there. That small token, that silent goodbye, had been my way of leaving a piece of myself with him. I wondered if he had kept it or if it had become just another forgotten trinket in a life filled with more important things. Months turned into years, and life marched on. I earned a promotion at work, moved into a slightly larger apartment, and even dipped my toes into dating again. But none of the men I met ever seemed to hold my attention. It wasn't that I was comparing them to William, I barely knew him, after all, but something about that night had awakened a longing in me that couldn't be easily ignored. I wanted more than polite dinners and surface-level conversations. I wanted to be seen, truly seen, the way William had seen me. I began to take small risks, ones I never would have considered before. I signed up for a painting class, even though I hadn't picked up a brush since I was a child. I said yes to spontaneous weekend trips with friends instead of staying home to catch up on work. I even learned to dance, properly this time, and found a kind of joy in the sway of movement that I'd never allowed myself to feel before. It was as though that one night had opened a door, and even though William wasn't on the other side of it, the path it revealed was still mine to walk. And yet, there were moments when I felt the absence of him like a phantom limb. I'd wonder where he was, what he was doing, if he ever thought of me the way I thought of him. Did he remember my laugh? The way my hand fit in his as we danced? Or had I become just another memory, blurred by the passing of time? I told myself it didn't matter, that our connection had been fleeting by design. But there were nights when the questions kept me awake, and I'd find myself staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of our time together. I thought about writing to him, though I had no address, no means of reaching him. Even if I did, what would I say? Thank you for changing me? For showing me a version of myself I didn't know existed? It felt too large, too impossible to distill into words. And so I said nothing, carrying the memory of him like a quiet secret, tucked away in a corner of my heart. Life has a way of moving forward, whether you're ready for it or not. Promotions came and went. Friends drifted in and out of my life. My hair turned gray, my skin lined with the traces of time. But no matter how many years passed, the memory of that night remained vivid, like a painting whose colors refused to fade. Looking back now, I can see that my encounter with William was more than just a single night. It was a catalyst, a turning point that nudged me toward a life I might not have had the courage to pursue otherwise. He had been a mirror, reflecting back to me the parts of myself I had been too afraid to acknowledge. And though I may never know what became of him, I know this: he gave me something no one else ever had. He gave me a glimpse of who I could be, if only I dared. Looking back now, it's clear that meeting William wasn't just a fleeting moment in my life, it was the stone that caused ripples in the still water of who I was. At the time, I didn't realize how much that single night would linger, shaping my choices, my relationships, even the way I saw myself. But as the years stretched on, I began to understand, the impact of a connection doesn't always end when the moment does. In the weeks and months that followed, I started to notice subtle changes in myself. At first, they were small, tiny shifts in the way I carried myself or approached my daily routine. I smiled more, not because I was happier exactly, but because I felt lighter, less weighed down by the expectations I had placed on myself for so long. I began to take the scenic route on my walk to work, stopping to admire the flowers in the park or the street performers playing saxophones on the corner. For the first time, I allowed myself to notice the beauty in the ordinary. At work, my newfound perspective translated into a quiet but palpable confidence. I spoke up more in meetings, asserting ideas I once would have kept to myself for fear of being dismissed. I started saying no to tasks that didn't align with my goals, something I had never felt brave enough to do before. My colleagues noticed the change. "You seem different," one of them remarked one afternoon. "Like you found some secret you're not sharing with the rest of us." I just smiled and said, "Maybe I have." Outside of work, I began to reclaim parts of myself I had long buried. I signed up for dance lessons, something I'd never considered before that night with William. At first, I felt self-conscious, fumbling through the steps as the instructor guided us through a basic waltz. But with time, I found my rhythm, and with it, a sense of joy I hadn't known I was missing. Dancing wasn't just about the movements, it was about trust, about letting go of control and allowing yourself to be led. It reminded me of the way William had guided me that night, his hand steady on my back, his gaze reassuring. The dance studio became my sanctuary, a place where I could shed the weight of the outside world and simply be. I made friends there, women and men who shared their own stories of transformation, of discovering parts of themselves they'd thought were lost. In them, I found a sense of community I hadn't realized I craved. And in myself, I found a new kind of freedom. But the changes weren't all external. Inside, I felt a shift, a loosening of the tight grip I'd kept on my emotions for so long. I began to allow myself to feel, to embrace vulnerability in ways I had always avoided. It wasn't easy, it was messy, uncomfortable, and sometimes painful, but it was real. I started writing in a journal, pouring out thoughts and memories I had kept locked away. William featured often in those pages, not as a figure of regret but as a symbol of possibility. Through that process, I came to understand something important. It wasn't just William who had changed me. It was the way he had reflected back to me the version of myself I had been too afraid to acknowledge. That night, he hadn't seen me as the quiet, reserved woman I had always been. He had seen something deeper, something truer. And in doing so, he had given me permission to see it too. Over time, that inner transformation began to ripple outward, touching every corner of my life. I started to reevaluate my relationships, questioning which ones truly nourished me and which ones I had been maintaining out of habit or obligation. I ended a long-standing friendship that had grown toxic, realizing that I deserved better than the constant criticism and one-sided support. It was painful, but it was also liberating. I also found myself approaching love with a newfound openness. For years, I had avoided dating, convincing myself that I was too busy or too set in my ways. But after William, I couldn't ignore the longing for connection that had been stirred within me. I went on dates, some awkward, some pleasant, and a few that held real promise. None of them became what I had with William, how could they? But they taught me something important, that I was capable of opening my heart again. One night, years later, I found myself in a hotel bar, much like the one where I had met William. I was traveling for work again, though this time as a keynote speaker rather than an attendee. The bar was dimly lit, the air filled with the soft strains of live jazz. I ordered a glass of Pinot Noir, smiling to myself at the memory the wine evoked. As I sat there, I couldn't help but wonder, did William ever think of me? Did he ever look out over a city skyline and remember the night we shared? Or had I become just another fleeting moment in a life filled with them? I would never know, and perhaps it was better that way. Our connection had been perfect in its impermanence, untouched by the complications of real life. It had given me exactly what I needed, a spark, a reminder, a glimpse of who I could be. That night in the bar, I raised my glass in a quiet toast, not just to William but to the woman I had become because of him. She wasn't perfect, far from it, but she was braver, more open, more alive. And for that, I would always be grateful. The years rolled on, as they always do, quietly but relentlessly. I moved through life, collecting the joys and sorrows that make up a full existence. My career flourished in ways I never thought possible, and I eventually traded the demands of corporate life for something softer, a quieter role mentoring young women who were just beginning their journeys. I married once, briefly, to a kind man who made me laugh and who loved me in a way that was steady but never consuming. We parted amicably, realizing that what we wanted from life didn't align in the ways that mattered most. I never had children, though I became a beloved aunt to the kids of my friends and colleagues. And through it all, there was William. Not in the foreground, not in a way that disrupted my life or held me back, but always there. Like a melody I couldn't forget, threading itself through my days in unexpected ways. Sometimes it was the sight of a city skyline, glittering against a dark sky. Other times, it was the soft strains of a jazz tune filtering through a cafe, or the brush of a stranger's hand as I passed them in a crowded space. He was there in the spaces between, in the quiet moments when my mind wandered and my heart ached for something I couldn't quite name. It was in my 60s, on a rare trip back to the city where it all began, that the memories of him resurfaced with an intensity one hadn't felt in years. I was there for a reunion of sorts, a gathering of colleagues from the early days of my career. The city had changed, as cities do, but its pulse remained the same, alive, electric, full of possibility. The hotel where I stayed wasn't the same one where I had met William, but it carried a similar elegance, the same sense of timelessness. On my second night there, after the reunion dinner had wrapped up, I felt a familiar restlessness. The kind I had felt all those years ago when I stepped into that bar for the first time. And so, without much thought, I found myself wandering into the hotel's lounge, a space that was smaller and quieter than the bustling bar I remembered, but no less inviting. I ordered a glass of Pinot Noir, smiling softly at the nostalgia of it, and took a seat near the window. The city lights stretched out before me, glittering and alive, and for a moment, I let myself be transported back. I could almost feel William's presence beside me, hear his voice teasing me about my choice of drink, his laughter warm and unguarded. It was then that the bartender approached me, carrying a small box. "Are you Linda?" he asked, his expression polite but curious. I blinked, startled. "Yes, I am." "This was left for you," he said, setting the box on the table. "It's been here for quite some time." One of our former staff members found it in the safe during renovations and left a note to keep it just in case you ever returned. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the box. It was simple, unadorned, but the weight of it felt immense. With trembling hands, I opened it, revealing 2 items inside, the bracelet I had left behind on the nightstand all those years ago, and a note, folded carefully and yellowed with age. I unfolded the note with care, my heart pounding in my chest. The handwriting was elegant and precise, unmistakably William's. It read, "Linda. I never forgot that night, the way you laughed, the way you danced, the way you saw right through the parts of me I usually keep hidden. You gave me something I didn't realize I needed, a reminder of what it feels like to truly connect. For that, I will always be grateful. I kept the bracelet because it felt like a piece of you, something I wanted to carry with me. But I'm leaving it here now, in case you ever come back. It belongs with you, just as the memory of you belongs with me. Be well, Linda. And know that you meant more to me than one night could ever capture. William." Tears blurred the words as I read them, my chest tightening with a mixture of joy and sorrow. He had remembered. I wasn't just a fleeting moment in his life, any more than he was in mine. He had carried me with him, just as I had carried him. I slipped the bracelet onto my wrist, the cool silver pressing against my skin. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for me all this time. I stayed in the bar for a while longer, staring out at the city lights and letting the memories wash over me. I didn't cry, not fully, though my eyes remained wet and my heart felt tender in a way that was both painful and beautiful. When I finally left, the bracelet was still on my wrist, and the note was tucked safely into my bag. It was enough, I realized. I didn't need to know more about what had happened to William, where his life had taken him, or whether he had found happiness. The note was a gift, a confirmation of something I had always felt in my heart but had never dared to fully believe, that what we shared was real, and that it had mattered. Even now, all these years later, I still wear the bracelet sometimes. It catches the light when I move, a quiet reminder of a man who saw me for who I was and a moment that taught me who I could be. The bracelet became a part of me after that night in the bar. Its presence on my wrist was subtle, but it carried a weight far beyond its delicate design. Each time I caught a glimpse of it, I felt William's words echoing in my mind, their sincerity a balm to the uncertainties I had carried for years. But as life pressed on, the immediacy of those memories began to fade. The letter was carefully tucked away in my jewelry box, alongside other keepsakes from different chapters of my life, and the bracelet spent more time resting in its velvet pouch than adorning my wrist. Not out of neglect or forgetfulness, but because its significance felt almost sacred. I wore it when I needed a reminder of courage, of possibility, of the woman I had once been and still was. It was nearly a decade later when I found myself revisiting the city, though this time not for work or reunions, but for something deeply personal. I had decided to retire from my consulting work, and the moment felt monumental enough to warrant a private kind of celebration. The city, with its unending energy and its place in my story, felt like the right destination. I booked a room at the same hotel where I had stayed that first time, more out of sentiment than convenience. It had changed, of course. The lobby was brighter, the decor more modern, but the bones of the building were the same. As I walked through its polished corridors, memories crept in, unbidden, but welcome. On my first night there, I wandered into the bar. It wasn't the same as the one where William and I had danced, nothing could be, but it carried an air of familiarity. The lighting was soft and warm, the tables arranged in intimate clusters. A small jazz trio played in the corner, their music weaving through the low hum of conversation. I found a seat at the bar and ordered a glass of Pinot Noir, smiling to myself as the bartender poured it. The first sip was like a gentle embrace, and for a while, I let myself get lost in the music and the taste of the wine. It wasn't nostalgia exactly, it was something quieter, a contentment born of knowing I had lived fully, even in moments I hadn't expected to. As the night wore on, I noticed a man seated a few stools down. He was older, perhaps around my age, and though his face was unfamiliar, something about his presence caught my attention. He seemed like someone who was waiting for something or someone, his hands resting idly around a glass of bourbon as his eyes scanned the room. I didn't plan to speak to him, but when his gaze met mine, he offered a small, polite smile. I returned it, and before I could think twice, I raised my glass slightly in a silent toast. To my surprise, he responded, his smile widening as he mirrored the gesture. "You look like you've been here before," he said, his voice carrying easily over the soft hum of the bar. "I have," I replied, shifting slightly on my stool to face him. "Though it's been a long time." "A lot can change in a long time," he said, his tone light but his eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes for the better. Sometimes not." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "And sometimes the things that matter don't change at all," I said. His expression softened, and for a moment, I thought he might ask what I meant. But instead, he said, "That's a comforting thought." The conversation didn't go much deeper. He eventually turned back to his drink, and I to mine, but the brief exchange left me feeling oddly at peace. It reminded me of William, not in the way the man looked or spoke, but in the way he had seen me, however briefly. There was something affirming about being noticed, even in passing, and it made me realize how much of my life had been shaped by that same recognition all those years ago. I lingered in the bar a little longer, letting the music and the wine wrap around me like a familiar blanket. When I finally returned to my room, I felt lighter, as though I had revisited not just the city but a part of myself I hadn't seen in a while. That trip marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life. Retirement was an adjustment, but it gave me the time and space to reflect on the journey I had taken. I found myself writing more, not just journaling, but crafting stories, fictional and otherwise, inspired by the moments and people who had shaped me. Inevitably, William found his way onto those pages, though I never named him. He remained a presence in my writing, a symbol of the unexpected connections that can alter the course of a life. Sometimes, I wondered if I would ever see him again. The thought wasn't obsessive or desperate, it was a quiet curiosity, a question I knew might never have an answer. But the uncertainty didn't trouble me. The gift of our connection wasn't in its longevity but in its depth, in the way it had taught me to live with more openness, more intention. As I sit here now, years later, with the bracelet resting on my wrist and the memory of William vivid as ever, I realize that revisiting the past isn't about clinging to what was. It's about honoring it, allowing it to remind us of who we were and who we've become. That night in the bar, the letter he left, the brief exchange with the stranger years later, they're all threads in the tapestry of my life, each one adding its own texture and color. And for that, I am grateful. I had always believed that life was a collection of fleeting moments, each one carrying its own weight, its own meaning. But there was something about William's note that stayed with me, long after the initial rush of finding it. I read it many times over the years, tracing the edges of his words with my fingertips as if I could feel him there, lingering between the lines. It wasn't long after I returned home from that trip that I decided to take the note out of its box again. The bracelet sat beside it on the small wooden table in my living room, catching the afternoon sunlight. There was something calming about the way it glinted, a quiet assurance that I was holding on to something real. As I unfolded the note, the familiar creases forming a pattern like a map, I read his words once more. Linda. I never forgot that night, the way you laughed, the way you danced, the way you saw right through the parts of me I usually keep hidden. You gave me something I didn't realize I needed, a reminder of what it feels like to truly connect. For that, I will always be grateful. I kept the bracelet because it felt like a piece of you, something I wanted to carry with me. But I'm leaving it here now, in case you ever come back. It belongs with you, just as the memory of you belongs with me. Be well, Linda. And know that you meant more to me than one night could ever capture. William. Every time I read it, the words seemed to take on new meaning, as if they carried layers I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just the sentiment, it was the way he had put it, the care he had taken to articulate something so ephemeral, so intangible. And the way he had left the bracelet behind, trusting it to find its way back to me, spoke volumes about who he was. For years, I had wondered what I had meant to him. Had I been a fleeting distraction, a brief reprieve from his responsibilities? Or had I been something more? The note didn't answer all of those questions, but it gave me something better: closure. It told me that I had mattered, that what we shared had been real. After rereading the note, I felt an urge to write back, even though I knew I couldn't send it. Sitting at my desk, with the soft hum of the city outside my window, I pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. William. Thank you for the note, and for leaving the bracelet. I found it at just the right time, though perhaps that's not a coincidence. I believe things come back to us when we're ready for them, and finding your words was like hearing a part of myself I hadn't listened to in years. You were right, our night together meant something to me, too. More than I understood at the time. It wasn't just about the connection we shared, it was about what you showed me about myself. About what it means to live with courage, with openness, with a willingness to embrace the unexpected. I don't know where life has taken you, but I hope it's been kind. I hope you found the peace and fulfillment you were looking for. And I hope you know that you left an indelible mark on my life. For that, I am grateful. Linda. I didn't sign my full name, nor did I date the letter. It wasn't meant for him to read. It was for me, a way to articulate the gratitude and closure I felt, to give shape to something that had lived quietly inside me for decades. When I finished, I folded the letter and tucked it into the same box where I kept his note and the bracelet. It felt right, as though our words belonged together, even if they would never meet. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting on the ways that brief connection had rippled through my life. William had given me more than just a memory, he had given me a lens through which to view the rest of my journey. Because of him, I had allowed myself to take chances, to open myself up to experiences I might have otherwise dismissed. It wasn't that he had changed me, exactly. It was that he had reminded me of the parts of myself I had forgotten. The parts that were bold, curious, willing to take risks. Those parts had always been there, but it took meeting him to bring them to the surface. One evening, I found myself at the piano in my living room, something I hadn't touched in years. It was old, slightly out of tune, but it still carried the echoes of my younger self, the girl who had dreamed of being an artist before practicality took over. As I played a few tentative notes, I thought of William again. Of the way he had encouraged me to embrace life, to let myself feel fully without fear of judgment. The melody that filled the room was simple, improvisational, but it felt like a conversation. A way of speaking to him, even if only in spirit. When I finished, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something profound and unnameable, a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. That night, as I sat in the quiet of my home, the bracelet resting on my wrist, I realized something important. William's note wasn't just a message from him, it was a reminder from the universe, a nudge to keep living with the same openness and courage that had brought me to him in the first place. I didn't know if I would ever see him again. But in a way, it didn't matter. He had already given me everything I needed. The beauty of time is that it gives you perspective. Sitting here now, at the edge of my life's later years, I see everything differently. It's as though the pieces of my story, scattered and chaotic at times, have quietly arranged themselves into a mosaic, revealing patterns I couldn't see before. And in that mosaic, William's presence shines as one of the most vivid and transformative pieces. It wasn't just the night we shared or the note he left behind. It was what they symbolized, the courage to step outside the confines of a life I thought was safe, the power of connection to awaken something deeply buried, and the quiet truth that even fleeting moments can shape us in ways we never imagined. As I sit here, the bracelet still snug on my wrist, I think often about the lessons I've learned from that chapter of my life. They aren't grand or revolutionary, but they are mine, forged in the quiet intimacy of a connection that defied logic and time. The first lesson is about vulnerability. For so many years, I lived with walls around me, convinced they were necessary to protect myself. But meeting William taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's strength. It's the willingness to be seen, to let someone in, even if only for a moment. That night, I allowed myself to be open in a way I never had before, and it changed me. It made me braver, not just in love, but in every aspect of my life. The second lesson is about impermanence. So often, we cling to the idea that things must last to matter. But my time with William was fleeting, and yet it left a mark more permanent than many relationships that spanned years. I've come to understand that some connections aren't meant to last forever. They're meant to remind us of something, to nudge us toward a path we might not have taken otherwise. And that's enough. The third lesson is about choice. When I walked out of William's suite that morning, it wasn't because I didn't care. It was because I did. I knew that what we had was perfect in its simplicity, and to try to stretch it into something it wasn't would have risked ruining it. I made a choice to let it remain what it was, a memory, a moment, a spark. And that choice has given me peace. Of course, there are still moments when I wonder, what would my life have been like if I had stayed? If I had taken his invitation to explore the connection further? Would we have been happy? Would we have hurt each other? It's a mystery I'll never solve, but I've learned to make peace with that, too. Because the truth is, the life I lived, the choices I made, the risks I took, was shaped in part by what we shared. And for that, I wouldn't change a thing. As I grow older, I find myself drawn more and more to the idea of legacy, not in the grand sense, but in the quiet ways we leave pieces of ourselves behind. I wonder sometimes if William ever shared our story with anyone. If he ever mentioned me in passing to a friend, or if I remained a secret he kept close to his heart. Either way, it doesn't matter. The legacy of what we shared lives on in me, in the way I've carried his memory and let it shape my journey. And in a way, I've shared that legacy, too. Through the stories I've told, the advice I've given to young women finding their way, the moments of courage I've tried to inspire. When I see someone take a leap of faith, whether in love or life, I think of him. And I hope that, wherever he is, he's doing the same. I've thought about writing our story down properly, not just for myself, but for others. Not as a tale of romance or regret, but as a testament to the power of connection. To remind people that even the briefest moments can change us, that the people we meet, no matter how briefly, can leave an indelible mark. I don't know if anyone would read it, but I think it would feel good to see it all laid out, a tangible record of something that has lived in my heart for so long. As I sit here now, watching the sunlight filter through the trees outside my window, I feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. For the life I've lived, for the people I've loved, and for the lessons I've learned along the way. And yes, for William. He was just one part of my story, but he was a vital part, a spark that lit a fire I didn't even know I needed. I will carry him with me always, not as a ghost or a regret, but as a reminder. A reminder to live fully, to love openly, and to embrace the moments that take your breath away, even if they last only a heartbeat. And so, I'll raise a glass tonight, as I've done many times before. Not just to William, but to the woman I became because of him. A woman who learned to dance, to laugh, to take chances. A woman who, in her own quiet way, learned to live. To William, and to all the moments that shape us. Cheers. If you've enjoyed my story, please leave your comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, where your support means the world to me. I look forward to bringing you more stories that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.